It's good to be with you at Ferny Hill again, even although it's in a virtual way and through this recording. But I hope that as we share together in God's Word tonight, you'll find it to be a blessing and an encouragement to you, and that you will be able to find your own way in a wayward world. We're thinking about wisdom and the need for wisdom in the world in which we live today, a world that could be described even by the teacher of Ecclesiastes as a wayward world. I guess all of us are trying to make sense of our apparently senseless world today. We're often asking the question, what is wrong with the world? As we look around the world today, we see all sorts of chaos. We see chaos in France just over this last day or two with terrorist attacks. We see similar situations breaking out in Nigeria as people come into conflict with authority. We see the struggle for power in the United States of America, where all sorts of ethical boundaries are broken, and the desire for power drives men to say strange things. Even in the UK here, we are continuing to wrestle with the COVID problem, the corona problem. And we often try to find solutions, don't we, for our question, what is wrong with the world? Whether it's economic understanding, maybe a better way to do things, whether it's a capitalist way or a socialist way. We have ways of explaining how the economies of the world ought to work better. It might be sociological, our understanding of the human beings and human behaviour. And we're trying to guide and curtail people's behaviour through increased legislation, and yet the world still seems to be a senseless place. Politically, of course, our leaders always tell us that they have the answers, and yet our world never seems to get out of the bit, and at times we struggle. Maybe even we have theological answers, and I hope that as Christians we think carefully about how we answer the question, what is wrong with the world? G.K. Chesterton, when he was asked the question, so what is wrong with the world, answered, I am. And here we have a profound insight into the realities of the problems that we face in the world. And the man of wisdom recognises that the problems begin on his own doorstep, are laid at his own feet, because even there our lives are not what they ought to be. This evening we're coming to look at this whole question of the wise man and how he tries to evaluate what's going on in the world, wisdom in a wayward world. And as we look at the passage from Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 15 down to 29, we're going to grapple with the same problems that he's grappling with. We'll discover that the book of Ecclesiastes, although written so long ago, remains to be contemporary, a contemporary commentary on our life today. The wayward world that we see around us in the 21st century was not so different to the world of the teacher. The teacher in that day, whether it's Solomon or some other wise man or wise men who put this book together, described the whole scenario that they saw around them as being meaningless. Meaninglessness is the catchword that they used to describe their world in their day. This is based, you may have heard already in the series, on a Hebrew word, hevel. It's a difficult word to translate into English. It's more of a concept than a direct meaning. And maybe some of the things that would help us to understand the concept of meaninglessness are things like breath-like, like a vapour, like something that's here for a moment and gone, that cannot be grasped. Something that is perhaps futile. It seems to have no meaning or purpose. It goes round in circles. Maybe something that is empty, like a chasing after the wind is one of the phrases that the teacher uses in the book of Ecclesiastes. Chasing after the wind, we know, can be a very fun thing to do as a child, but as adults we soon see the difficulty of such childish behaviour. Life is beyond comprehension, isn't it? It's beyond comprehension. The complexities of life are such that there are no simple solutions, no simple answers. And as we get older in life and as we grow in life experience, we increasingly understand the complexities of life. We recognise that it is not subject to simple explanations that would give us easy answers. In fact, when we apply our intellect to understanding the world, we soon discover that even our greatest intellects, even the greatest minds, are unable to explain it well. And that really brings us to the book of Ecclesiastes. This man is a wise man. This is a man who has committed his life and his intellect and his research powers to trying to understand and discover the meaning of the world, the difficulties of the world. He struggles with what he sees. He sees righteous people who suffer. He sees wicked men who prosper. And he cannot reconcile these great anomalies in his experience. And so we too struggle with the same kind of things as we look at our world today. And we might categorise it as being a wayward world. As we come to look at the wise man's conclusions in this part of the book of Ecclesiastes, we come to a chapter which is quite difficult. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 is not only difficult to say, but it's difficult to understand. I grappled a little bit with this passage and struggled a bit to understand really what was going on. When I turned to the commentaries to get some help, one of the commentaries said that this was probably the most difficult chapter in the whole of Ecclesiastes, the most difficult chapter in a most difficult book. So bear with me as I try to share with you my own understanding of this tricky passage. Human wisdom is the thing that's at the fore here. Human wisdom is got to be understood in its context. It is human. It is human. It's human perspective. And in the light of this incomprehensible world in which we live, human wisdom has its limitations, has its abilities to understand, and yet great shortcomings. And so we listen to the wise man as he tries to assess the wayward world around him. And his counsel comes to us in these verses between verses 16 and 17. He says, be righteous. Be righteous. Be upright people. Be people who know how to behave ethically and morally. Be people who pay attention to the virtues of life. Be a righteous person. Uphold these virtues in your life and ensure that you are well behaved in that sense. Be a righteous person. But no sooner are the words out of his mouth than he qualifies that call to righteousness and says, but don't be over righteous. It seems like that he's walking a knife edge here, because he's already recognised that even the righteous suffer. It's not like being righteous is going to save you from suffering or save you from calamity. No, in fact, Job is the great story that tells us just of how untrue that idea is. In fact, be righteous, but don't be over-righteous, because even the over-righteous people will suffer. Don't put yourself to any great bother in your righteousness, says the wise man with human wisdom. Be wise, he says, but don't be over-wise. He says the same kind of thing here. And we're struggling to understand this tension that he finds. He recognises that even wise men can look foolish at times. Even wise men, when they speak, cannot speak absolute truth, cannot speak absolute standards into their world. So be wise, but don't pretend to be overwise. Don't set yourself up for a fall. Here is the counsel of the so-called wise man. And of course he tells us also, don't be over wicked. Well, the whole of Scripture would stand in that place and say that we should not be wicked people. And the wise man understands that there is great calamity coming to those who pursue wickedness, that ultimately they will be called to account. And while they may seem to prosper in the course of their life, the reality is that one day they will be held to account. Don't be a fool, says the wise man. Don't be a fool. Recognise that you will be held to account for all the circumstances of your life and all the actions of your life. It seems as we listen to the wisdom, the human wisdom of the wise man, that there's not really very much that he's being decisive about. He sounds like a politician. He sounds like some kind of ambassadorial person trying to walk both ways. And in fact, this is exactly the counsel that he gives. He says, grab a hold of one, but don't let go of the other. Grab a hold of righteousness, but don't let hold of less upright behaviour, because that may also have some value to you in time. Well, it's a remarkable kind of conclusion. It seems that the wise man comes to a conclusion in verse 18 that he recognises may be a conclusion reached by so-called God-fearers. So-called God-fearers may try to live this kind of balanced life, but it's not the true life that pleases God. God-fearers might suggest that we behave the right way. God-fearers might suggest that we do the right thing. But in truth, there is no one who is righteous, is the conclusion. You may well look good before society. You may portray a particular persona, a particular mask in front of others. You may look like a God-fearer. You may have righteous behaviour. You may not be over wicked. But in truth, you've fallen short of the divine standard. You've fallen short of God's glory, as the New Testament would say. And we deserve the wrath of God as a result. And so the wisdom of the human wise man leaves us in a place where truly we are not finding great solutions to his explanation of this senseless world. As we continue to look at this idea of human wisdom, it's important for us just to flag exactly what the traps are here. And I want you to see these because these come home to roost in our own lives even today. We don't just point the finger here at a man of long ages past who tried to explain his world and say, well, he didn't get it right. The truth of the matter is that we continue to make the same mistakes. It's a trap into which each of us can fall very easily. Sometimes we think we are righteous, do we not? Sometimes we see ourselves, we perceive ourselves as being righteous, that our righteousness is something, is worth something. We even think that perhaps we are better than others. We are better than others. We have a higher standard, a higher moral standard than our neighbour. And sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that our own self-righteousness is of some worth. That's a trap. Sometimes we think that our own wisdom offers the answers to every problem. We can solve it. We can solve it. We see this in our society today. We see it amongst political leaders today, world leaders who are battling with a problem that they cannot solve, that they have no answers to. And in their own wisdom, they make these great pronouncements. We will beat this. We will overcome this. And yet they are not prepared to acknowledge their lack of wisdom, their lack of solution, their lack of problem solving, to humble themselves. And yeah, we would say to cry out to God and say, God, help us in the midst of our lack of wisdom. God said, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of me, and God would grant it to them. Yeah, thinking that we're not as wicked as some is a problem that we fall into often, isn't it? We look across the street or across the world. We hang our heads and are appalled by the terrible and ruinous acts of different individuals who may act in violation of others, or in the murder, or maybe in the abuse of many people. We think of political leaders who may be corrupt in some way, and we hold ourselves in some kind of high esteem as though we were much better than they. And yet the reality is, if we are honest, we know our hearts, and we know the trouble and the problems that we ourselves can bring by our own behaviour, by our own sinful standards, and we recognise truly that, yeah, we are a wicked people. Yeah, sometimes we portray ourselves as not being foolish, but how foolish we can be when deliberately and even with intent we turn to sin. We turn to the ways of wickedness. When we turn away from the living God by our own sinful nature, and we wallow in the in the mud and the mire of sin. Yeah, we can be foolish too, can't we? We're not as wise as we think we are often, and our righteousness is often tainted by our own faults and shortcomings. You might say, well, Alan, actually, I've got it well balanced. Yeah, I'm not as bad as the people down the street, and okay, I'm not as good as as gold, but in truth, I live a pretty balanced life. Well, of course, this is a Hellenistic idea. This is not a Christian idea. While balance is important in life, and while it's important for us to be able to live before God with stewardship of our time and our resources and in balanced ways, giving account to God for all that we are and all that He has given us. And the truth of the matter is, this isn't just a balancing exercise. The balances are weighed against us. Belshazzar found that, didn't he? Yeah, Belshazzar found that he had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. And so thinking of our own reputation, that our reputation will somehow do, is the trap of human wisdom. The trap of human wisdom suggests that we have the answers, that we have the wisdom, that we have the righteousness. In truth, there is not a righteous man on earth, says the wise man, who does what is right and never sins. These words are most likely taken up by the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 3 and verse 10, where he says, "There is no one who is righteous, not even one." And this seems to be an interim conclusion as we read down the passage that was before us tonight, between verses 15 to 29. This conclusion that, in fact, as we look at the world, as we try to make sense of our senseless world, the reality is that there is not one righteous person on earth who does what is right consistently and never sins. And so, in the words of the Gettys, we have to work with the wise man and listen again to what he has to say. And what he has to say is really summed up in the lyric of their great song, "When Trials Come" is the title of the song. But in the second verse they say, "I turn to wisdom, not my own." And this is really the second half of this little passage that I want us to look at. How do we turn to wisdom, not our own? How do we turn afresh to God's wisdom and see it? And this is exactly what the wise man seems to do. His human wisdom is applied in the opening verses of the section, but he reverts in the end to God's wisdom, for only God's wisdom will give him answers to the senseless world that he sees around him. This is true wisdom. This is wisdom from God. The nature of true wisdom is such that the wise man says, it's beyond me. This is beyond my capability to understand. This is beyond my wisdom to be able to explain. It is beyond me. This story is told again in Job chapter 28. In Job 28, he portrays wisdom as being hidden away from man. And even though he digs to the deepest recesses of the earth, and though he mines the deepest treasures of the earth, he cannot find wisdom there. And even if he goes to the highest heights of heaven, he cannot find wisdom there. Where is it to be found? He discovers where wisdom is to be found. It's to be found where God is. It's afar off, says the teacher in Ecclesiastes. It's far off. It's somehow removed from us and from our domain. And yet at the same time, he recognizes that if we can but grasp something of this wisdom, something of true wisdom, then it changes our perspective on life altogether. It changes our perspective. It allows us to see not with human eyes any longer, but with God's eyes. It allows us to see not with human wisdom, but with God's wisdom, true wisdom. And it gives us understanding. Suddenly there is enlightenment in the place of darkness. Suddenly the light goes on, the lights go on, and we understand exactly what may well be happening in this barren and sinful world of ours. A world that increasingly turns its back upon God's wisdom and seeks their own wisdom. Not only does it give us understanding, it gives us that perspective of God upon the world. a perspective that says even the greatest wisdom of mankind, no matter how wise he seems to be, is absolute folly compared to God's great wisdom. These are the words that Paul the Apostle took up in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 2, isn't it? Where he compares human wisdom to God's wisdom and recognises the paltry nature of even human wisdom. It is not even compared to God's folly, if God had folly as such. And so we recognise that it gives us proper perspective, puts us in our proper place. And was that Job's experience? Job's experience too was that although he had hard questions to ask, although he was trying to make sense of a senseless world, in truth God put him in his place and said, "How dare you ask me and call me to account?" And Job was able to recognise the proper perspective of who he is. He is but the creature when he stands in awe of the great Creator. And I guess true wisdom, according to the wise man, also saves us from the way of wickedness. In verse 26, he recounts some of the words of wisdom that feature perhaps in the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 5 and 6 and 7, where wisdom, although portrayed as a woman, folly is also portrayed as a woman, and the great folly of falling into the hands of the adulterous woman. And here the teacher in Ecclesiastes does a similar thing. Don't be concerned, please, about the phrasing that he uses here, where he speaks about one man in 1,000 being found to be wise, but never finding a woman who is wise. I don't think for a moment that the writer here is making a suggestion that women can never be wise or that only men can be wise. In fact, he's gathering up the truth of the fact that mankind in totality, male and female, are found to be falling short of God's great wisdom, and there's no wisdom, true wisdom, to be found among them except in a very exceptional case. We'll come to that in a moment. Because you see, true wisdom points us to one man. True wisdom only points us to one man, not to the teacher, not to a Solomon, not to any man that would have his origins here on earth. No, true wisdom must give way, or our wisdom, must give way to true wisdom, must give way to the revelation of God himself, so that he brings wisdom to our minds. And I think as the writer here speaks of finding one man in 1,000, I can't help but have my mind go to the Lord Jesus Christ. The New Testament speaks of Jesus, of course, having become wisdom from God for us. And this is the great revelation. This is the revelation which opens our hearts and our minds to knowing who God is and understanding what God's ways are. And we're able to walk in his ways and to walk in the wisdom of the Lord, to fear the Lord, as the wisdom writers often tell us to do, to honour the Lord and to fear him. I guess that one man in 1,000 points me to Jesus. Probably the writer in Ecclesiastes was not thinking in these terms, but I wonder in my own reading of the passage if there's not some prophetic indicator there pointing us to the one man, Jesus Christ. True wisdom points us to our need for the man who became wisdom for us from God, the person of Jesus Christ. And so that's the considered conclusion of the wise man, really. He comes to the end to say that, from the outset, God made mankind, he made the human race upright, made them righteous, made them wise. But he recognises their folly, he recognises their waywardness, he recognises the fact that they have turned away from the wisdom of God, they've turned away from God himself, and have gone in search of many schemes. Yeah, that is the condemnation. That's the considered conclusion. As we look around the world today, we recognise a world that is turning its back on God. At times we feel increasingly turning its back upon God. And yet we recognise that it's only by God's grace and only by his mercy towards people like us, that we have come into an understanding of who Jesus is and how we can find wisdom in the midst of a world of folly, a wayward world. So, wisdom in a wayward world. What is wrong with the world? I guess if we have understanding, if we have perspective, if we're able to say that we've embraced true wisdom and embraced the person of the Lord Jesus Christ in whom that wisdom is found, then we recognise that actually what is wrong with the world is that I am wrong with the world. And if there is anything that has changed in me, if there is anything that's good in me, if there is anything of God's grace to be seen in me, then the honour and the glory is to go to Him. For we fear Him, we honour Him, we worship Him in the midst of a senseless world. I trust that that's helpful, just to give you some perspective on a very difficult time and a very difficult situation in our world today. Let's hold fast to the wisdom of God. Let's continue to fear the Lord, because this is the beginning of true wisdom. Amen.